Welcome back, the Black
Season
Sheep
2.
podcast.
Woo, 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 woo.
They tried to get rid of us,
Did they?
but we're back.
If by they you mean grad school applications, then sure.
No,
But
it's actually been a
we're
pretty
back.
smooth ride.
Yeah.
But yeah, here we are. Today we are speaking with Daniel Everett, a linguist and former missionary who
Who lived with
after
the Piraha tribes and the Amazon for several years.
yes, after spending many years in the Amazon among some indigenous people, actually retired from his beliefs and
That's a weird word choice. He left the
retired.
church.
He
He
left the
became
church.
became atheist.
Yes. But his experiences in the Amazon are really interesting from just sort of a whatever you want to call it, anthropological, whatever cultural standpoint. And it brought him to a really interesting place. So I'm happy that he's decided to join us today.
Yeah, he has a very interesting story, and I'm ready to talk about him.
So if we're ready to get right into it, what we usually start with just sort of a basic introduction of who you are and your history in linguistics and the Amazon.
Yeah. Okay. I was born in Southern California and was very active in rock and roll until the end of the 60s when I met a missionary family from Brazil. Actually, I met their daughter at a Jimi Hendrix concert and in San Diego. And I got very interested in what they were doing and hearing about the Amazon. I grew up on the border with Mexico, so I was always interested in other cultures and other languages. And we got married. I got married to their daughter at 18, and we went into our training. I took a degree in Bible and theology from the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. And after that, we spent a summer working with indigenous peoples in Mexico, just as a sort of training, preliminary training. Then we began our linguistics training. Based on our performance, we were either accepted into the mission or not. The purpose of the mission was to translate the Bible into remote indigenous groups and areas. After 3 semesters of intense linguistics training, about 30 credits, graduate credits, we went to back to Mexico, southern Mexico, to live 5 months among the Celtal people in the state of Chiapas in the jungle and learn about life in the jungle. After that, we moved to Brazil, and in December 1977, I first landed by myself. Well, not with my family, myself and one other person. We landed in the village of the Piraha, and I stayed there for about 10 days. That was my very first visit, and in that time I learned to say several things and in the language and got to know the people. And then I went out and got my family, and over the next 38 years, I spent more than 8 years in the jungle with the people. I eventually abandoned my missionary goals and abandoned religion altogether as I got to know the people better and understand more about other cultures and what I was actually interested in life. And I did my PhD in linguistics in Brazil at the University of Campinas, and taught there for a couple of years, all the time spending roughly 4 to 6 months every year in the village. I moved to the University of Pittsburgh, where I was a professor and department chair for 10 years, and then to the University of Manchester in England, Illinois State University, and now Bentley University in Massachusetts. But up until 2009, from 1977 until 2009, I was 4 to 6 months every year among the Piraha, with a couple of exceptions. And in 1980, we spent the entire year among the Piraha.
Right. So what initially got you so invested in wanting to go to this tribe and study their languages?
Well, it was the contact with my wife's family. My wife grew up in the Amazon, and I wanted to do something that wasn't, this was the end of the 60s, and materialism was not something that I was after. I wasn't interested in a career that would make money. I wanted a career that would bring me an interesting life, one that could help others. And going to the Amazon and living in the jungle with these people and helping them medically. We had some basic medical training, and we did suturing. We did all sorts of minor first aid and medical work. But that was the motivation. And then when I started taking linguistics classes and some anthropology, I got much more interested in the scientific aspects of it, especially since I began to see the lack of fit between Western religion and Amazonian beliefs.
So did you learn the Piraha language solely from the people there, or did you learn it outside?
Yeah, there was no other way to learn it. I learned it from the people there. There was there were two other missionary teams that had preceded us. One went in, and the first went in 1958, and they worked till about 1967. They left, and another team came in 67 and was there with the people until 76. And then we came in 1977. And but neither of the other two had really mastered the grammar of the language. One of them, I knew them both very well. One of them, Stephen Sheldon, still speaks the language, but he did. I wouldn't say that he mastered the analysis of the language. He did a lot of good work on it, but his advice to me when we were going in there was, I probably have it all wrong, so ignore everything I've written and start over. And so that's what I did. As it turned out, he didn't have everything wrong, but there were a lot of things I disagreed with, and I'm glad that he gave me that advice, because that was very important.
What's the process like of trying to learn a language without really having learned it from someone who speaks your language as well? Like having to learn it from people who only speak that language?
A linguist, my first linguistics professor at the University of Oklahoma was a pioneer in this area. He was actually a professor at the University of Michigan, but a member of the mission, and spent his summers in Oklahoma for many years. But he pioneered the method called monolingual language learning. And I give demonstrations on it. If you search my name and monolingual demonstration on the internet, you will find a video that's been viewed about 40,000 times of me giving a demonstration to about 500 linguists on how to do exactly this. And actually, the movie Arrival, starring Amy Adams, was based on Ken Pike's work.
Interesting.
And what she does in the movie is exactly the monolingual method. So it's well done in that respect, which the director of that movie had an Ask Me Anything session on Reddit, and said that he made a point of putting in the background in Amy Adams's linguistics office on her bookshelf, my books, so that
interesting.
To show that I was continuing on with this method. So that's basically, you're going to a different planet almost, and you're having to figure out things from scratch. But linguistics can provide you with the field research kind of background that can enable you to do that.
Yeah, Arrival is good at portraying that sort of baseline to start communicating. Here's our conception of like walk, and going from there, just total ground zero. But I'm curious, when you actually arrived, in this tribe, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, there were some certain cultural disconnects, for example, in terms of things like eating, and what was seen as like normative food. I know you had an encounter with a woman who I think she was eating like a rat, and you're like, well, that looks pretty gross. And then she commented like, well, what you're eating also looks disgusting, but it was something that, people in America consider like very normal. Were there any, when you first arrived, were there any large like disconnects like that?
Oh, there was a lot of that. I mean, one of the important things is to establish respect and trust. And once you've established respect and trust, and one of the ways I did that was having my entire family with me. I had 3 small children. My son at that time was 9 months old. He's now the chair of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Miami in Florida, but he was 9 months old when we entered the village, and my daughters were 6 and 3. The 3-year-old got interested in the medical work, and she's now an executive with CVS Pharmacies, and has worked and does a lot of nursing instruction. My oldest daughter was interested in education when we were there, and she's now a school teacher in North Carolina. So there were a lot of things that came up in food. The Pirahãs don't eat salad or anything like that. It looks to them like you're eating leaves, and they say only animals eat leaves. Humans don't eat leaves. They found it very strange, that part of our diet. They found the toppings, we would sometimes have a bit of mustard or ketchup or something like that. Not very often, but sometimes we did. And they found this very strange. They would smell it and taste it and couldn't understand why we used that stuff. They would smell everything I offered them before they ate it and ask me about all the ingredients in it. They wouldn't just eat something unless they fully understood what was in it. And most of the time they would say, I don't know how to eat this, which is their way of saying, it's not for me. And I learned that expression. And if they would offer me something like that I wasn't interested in, I would tell them I don't know how to eat this. But I didn't use that phrase very much. I basically ate whatever they wanted me to share with them. And the interesting thing is some of the things that I don't like the brains of animals, which is kind of irrational not to like it, but they love it, and so they didn't want to share it anyway. So I was fine. Although I remember in when I was a boy, we lived in a rural environment, farmers in Southern California, and my grandfather's favorite breakfast was calf brains and scrambled eggs. So it wasn't that far off.
Interesting. What were some of the other foods that they like to eat?
Well, anything that's in the jungle. I mean, except snakes. They don't tend to eat snakes, but we've eaten jaguar and alligator and monkeys and tapirs, and pacas, small rodents. Well, paca is a large rodent. Capivara is the large. It looks like 100-pound rat, which is basically what it is. But the meat's very good on it, and paca is about a 15 to 25-pound rat, big rodent, and the meat on that's also very good, and it is white meat, and it is similar to chicken, whereas tapir meat is like beef. It's red meat. Alligator meat, the alligator tail tastes like a giant lobster tail.
Interesting. Did they have designated folks who went out to acquire that food, like designated hunters?
Well, there were always hunters. There were always people who were better at hunting and fishing than others. So people got excited, but everybody had to go out every day. Everyone was responsible for their own food. So everybody was out fishing and hunting, and the women were in the fields gathering wild food. And then from some of the small fields they had planted, they would gather, tubers like manioc and sweet potatoes, that kind of thing. But mainly it was 70% of their diet was probably fish. They live at the edge of a river, which by Amazonian standards is quite small, but it's a few hundred yards across. And so by American standards, it would be a good sized river. And it was teeming with fish. And there were 300 people that lived on it, lived on most of its length, which was over 300 miles. So there was plenty of wildlife and very few people. So hunting and fishing was not a problem for them. We tended to take in most of our food, my family, because I don't fish and hunt. In the early years, I would go with them to fish and hunt to learn the vocabulary. Once I learned about hunting and the culture of hunting, and at least to my satisfaction, and learned the words engaged in hunting and the expressions, I wasn't interested in going more. I did linguistic analysis. I basically would get up at 5 a.m. Most days and haul water up from the river for my family. We went through a lot of water every day, and I had a water system, a barrel with a spigot on it, and the barrel was a 55-gallon drum, so I would haul up about 55 gallons of water every morning from the river. That's a lot of water. Straight up a very steep bank. We would, usually have something like oatmeal for breakfast, that kind of thing. But we traded a lot with the Piraha. We had canned meat, and they love canned meat. So when they would get a lot of fish or more food than they could eat at one time, they would bring some to me to trade for canned meat, and I was happy to do that. Also, they had some old shotguns, and I would take in shotgun shells and trade shells for meat.
Canned food.
Yeah, that was the canned meat. Yeah, we would take that in.
Well, why did they like it though? Like, what made it different from?
Oh, well, it was just variety. They could tell it was protein, but also it kept. So if you have a lot of food and you want to trade for it, it's better to trade the fresh food for the canned food because it'll be there. So we never gave them much. It would just be a can or two, and somebody would put it up in their hut. And at some point, if they failed to get fish or something like that, they would have a can of food.
Yeah.
But by and large, they just ate fresh stuff straight from the river, straight from the jungle.
Well, I think it's really interesting when you mentioned that this tribe could be very selective and maybe unsure about certain foods if they're unsure about what is what is in the food. And this might be a pretty good segue into I guess the sort of technical way of putting it is their sense of like experiential liminality, right? If you would like to sort of get into that and explain what that concept means to the Piraha.
Well, things that come in and out of perception, whether it's hearing or smelling or seeing, in particular seeing, they find this very interesting. And this has to do with their belief of the world. Young children have similar views for different reasons. So young children, you play peekaboo with them because as the French psychologist Piaget pointed out, it takes them a while to develop a sense of object permanence, that the object is still there even though they can't see it. The Piraha have no problems with object permanence. They obviously know that, they definitely know that the object is there whether they can see it or not. But they love the experience. So if somebody's paddling up the river and they go around a curve, they have a word for that. It's called ibitpio. It means it just transcended experience. If they come back, it's the same word, ibitpio. As soon as you can see them, you say they ibitpio arrived or they ibitpio left, and you can say it about the sounds too. This concept fits with their view of the immediacy of experience, this experiential liminality. What you can experience is what's important. So you find that in the language, which has an extremely complicated word structure, although a very simple sentence structure, sort of a trade-off there. They have, even though they have 16 types of suffixes that can go on a verb, which means that, I think actually today my analysis, they have a lot more than that, but in my initial analysis, I identified 16 classes of suffixes, and I think some of those are broken down even smaller. But those 16 classes mean that every verb has about 65,000 possible forms, as opposed to English, which has verbs have 5 forms: sing, sang, sung, singing, sings. That's it. Some verbs hit, hits, hit, hit, hit. Hit is just doesn't have much going for it. So in English, we have a very, very simple word structure, and we have a relatively complicated sentence structure. In Piraha, they have a fairly simple sentence structure, maybe not as simple as our word structure, but simple, and a very, very complicated word structure. In fact, all American Indians, Native Americans, have a very, not all, but the vast majority have extremely complicated verb structures. That's just a fact about American Indians. When you see movies of somebody learning an indigenous language in a few weeks, you can tell that's fiction.
Yeah, not going to happen. And how many verb forms did you say there were? For
65,000 minimum.
Oh,
That's
so if you learn Spanish, you're talking about 40 or so.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and Spanish was difficult enough. That's fascinating. Well, but beyond just grammar and their language and their syntax, this notion of this experiential liminality also applies to sort of their mythology, or maybe their lack thereof of mythology, in sort of like religious beliefs. Is there a total absence of that among the Piraha?
This business of what's real is what you can see. So they're like the original scientists, empirical scientists. If you can see it and you can, or somebody else has seen it directly, then you can sort of trust it. But if you haven't, then it's speculative. So they can't see God, can't experience Him. So they have no concept of God. I mean, you can talk to them about what you believe and sort of get the ideas across, but it's not something they believe in. They have a sort of even the concepts of fact and fiction for them blur. For us, we know that if we're telling a fairy tale, that's fiction, and but for the Piraha, they can talk about entities they've seen that aren't human but look human. And it's not really fiction for them, but it's also not, they know that it's not completely truthful. They know that they are filling in the gaps of things they can't understand. But
Interesting.
they take that seriously, and they're willing to abandon that belief with other evidence. But in the meantime, it's sort of like what philosophers call inference to the best explanation for things. So a lot of science is that we can't prove that it's right, but it seems to be the best explanation. And sometimes in the future, it turns out that was fiction.
Yeah.
It's similar like that for Piraha. So it also affects their grammar. It affects their relationships. One of the interesting things about the Piraha society is that it is egalitarian. Everybody's pretty much equal, and nobody really tells other people what to do. Certainly, men don't tell other men what to do. Rarely do parents insist on telling children what to do. And men rarely tell their wives what to do. There are always violations of these things. These are general tendencies, and individual variation means, like if I were describing the U.S., I wouldn't say that we're a country of thieves. I would say that thievery is not valued in American society, and Americans are very much against theft. But are there a lot of Americans who steal? Yeah, probably everyone at one time or another. So there are always exceptions to broad cultural generalizations.
Yeah. So you arrive in the Piraha tribe originally to, I guess, proselytize, to spread religion as a missionary. Can you walk us through like sort of what that process is like how you tried to go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, first I had to learn the language, and once I learned the language, I would tell them about I came here because I love Jesus, and Jesus told me to tell you to listen to his story and believe in him, and when you die, you go up to heaven to be with him. None of that stuff really meant anything to them, because first of all, when they die, they're just dead. I mean, that's have you ever seen anybody go anywhere else? When they're dead, and I can show you his body if you want to see it. I mean, that's just the way it is. And the idea, who was Jesus anyway? I mean, he must have been a good friend of mine, but why would I believe your friend? I got friends too. Why would you can believe what they say too? I mean, they didn't have the idea that there was this supernatural entity or anybody who needs special, that should be listened to as more authoritative than anybody else. We're all people, and why should I let somebody else direct my life? I do what I need to do as long as I'm not hurting anyone else in society. So the whole concept, I have a book I wrote called Dark Matter of the Mind, which came out from the University of Chicago Press. It's a more technical book for anthropologists. And in that book, I go through all of the assumptions that I made that were part of my tacit understanding, the unconscious beliefs I had about the world but didn't realize that I had, and how there was just no way for it to fit. There was no way really for my Christian beliefs to fit in this Amazonian society unless that society was changed dramatically. But in fact, looking at their desire for evidence and the happiness of their lives and the way they got along day to day, and comparing that with my fellow Christians, my fellow missionaries, I was an ordained minister, and comparing that to other pastors, I realized that they were living lives that were supposed to be the kinds of lives that Christianity produced, but in my opinion, never did produce. A common reaction from other Christians, my ex-fellow Christians, when I tell them this is that, you can't just go by happiness. You can't just go by comparing people's lives. The Bible is true or it isn't true. And so I guess my response to that is it isn't. So I couldn't sustain the beliefs, the supernatural beliefs of my own culture, which now, given my exposure to the Pirahãs and thinking about this, Western religion seemed just like another form of superstition to me, and I wasn't interested in maintaining them. So I resigned from the church and resigned from being a missionary, and did my PhD in linguistics, and since have published in many areas, from philosophy to anthropology and linguistics. And I'm writing 2 books now on philosophy, but prior to that, I've written many books and articles on linguistics and anthropology, mainly linguistics.
Right. So, I mean, coming into this tribe and realizing that Western religion doesn't quite fit in, I mean, not only did it not fit in among the Piraha, but reflecting inwards, this seems to have affected you. Was there just sort of like a singular moment you can recall where you realized, like, wow, like I don't know if my personal beliefs are tenable anymore because of what I'm learning from these people, or did it just kind of happen over time?
It was both. There were a series of events that caused me to question, and that over time these events accumulated. I remember one time checking out my attempted translation of the Gospel of Luke, and reading all the begets, so-and-so beget so-and-so who beget so. I'm checking out the way that I had translated these names into Piraha with a good friend of mine, Piraha friend, and he realized that I didn't know these people, and so he just couldn't understand the point of me telling him that this was important information. These were dead people. I didn't know who they were, and he sure didn't know who they were. And I realized, I said, yeah, it is kind of bizarre for me to be telling him this stuff is important when it has no relevance to him at all. And so that was one of many, many incidents. And eventually I found much greater happiness in atheism. And when I told the Piraha finally that I no longer believed in God, they said, so you're finally like us. Great, you're more like us now. That's great. So we had a lot of laughs about that.
How did the Piraha react to, I guess, biblical stories in general? I know in your book you talked about how you played a recording and they kept playing the part where John the Baptist gets beheaded over and over again.
Yeah. They liked some of the stories, some of the events, but eventually they lost interest because they realized that I had never seen any of this myself. They were taking my word for it that this was a truthful eyewitness account of things I had seen. And when they realized that it wasn't anything of the sort, they lost interest in it. I mean, why am I telling you this? They would say, like, Jesus, Dan, does he look like us or does he look like you? Is he brown or is he white? And I said, well, some people say he was brown, some people say he was white. And they said, yeah, but you saw him, so what did he look like? And I said, well, I didn't see him. And they said, but your father saw him. I said, no, I don't know anybody who's ever seen him. And so then their reaction was, why are you telling us about him? It doesn't make any sense. It violates their cultural norms for you to talk about things that you have no experience with. And just think about, I mean, we do, as scientists or as average citizens, we talk about astronauts on the moon. We never saw it really. I mean, we saw films of it. So we believe films. We believe films like eyewitness accounts. But for another culture that doesn't believe two-dimensional images like films, nobody saw it, so why would I believe it? And this leads to a lot of conspiracy theories in this country because people don't want to take any evidence but their own for things. In a modern industrial society with an active science, you can believe some of the things that science says because eventually you could test it. You could go visit, like I've been to I've seen enough evidence that I actually believe that people went to the moon, even though I wasn't on the moon when they were. But, for God, there's no real way to do that. And for the Piraha, there's no motivation to even try because, they asked me once about the moon and had I ever really seen it because they don't know what I'm capable of. And I said, well, other Americans have been on the moon. And they said, was it really hot? And I said, no. They said it was very, very cold. They said, it looks like it would be really hot. We had these discussions, and then sometimes at night they would see a satellite going overhead and point it out to me, which I realized, wow, that's a satellite. And they would ask me what it was, and I said, it's like a radio thing that Americans and others put into the air. He said, how big is it? And I said, it's like, and I would show them with my hands about more or less how big I thought it was. Of course, I had no idea because they vary so much. Anyway, they trusted me, they believed me, but they weren't. Their worldviews were never seriously challenged or shaken. They're very secure, confident people who have a lot of pride in who they are and their culture.
Right. And they thought you might have been immortal, right?
Yeah. They don't know much about me. I don't look like anybody they have experience with. The only other outsiders they had experience with were Brazilians and these missionaries that preceded us. And the missionaries that preceded us, I remember Arlo died, the first guy who went in the 50s, really amazing outdoorsman, incredible outdoor skills. And he died just a couple of years ago, and he was in his 80s. And to them, that's just unheard of to live that long. And so they couldn't believe that he was still alive. So they asked me if Americans die. I said, yes, we die. And when I told them Arlo died, that was a shock to them, because even for some of the older men in the village, they had known him all their lives, even the ones who were born. My main language teacher, as far as I can tell, was born more or less at the same year I was born, very close to that. He could be a year or two from my age. I don't think he's much younger or older than I am. And he had known Arlo since he was a little boy. In fact, in Arlo's diaries, which I had, Arlo mentions him as a little boy. That's another reason I know he's my age, because Arlo estimates his age in the early 60s, and he would have been about the age I was then as well. So, we developed good relationships, good friendships, and trust and respect. And with that, you can learn a lot from each other, and you can express to each other when you don't believe what the other one is saying. You can be quite open in your conversations when there's no fear and there's trust and there's respect. So we were all very open about things, and we had a lot of good times together. They have wonderful senses of humor. They don't tell jokes in the standard way, but they have tremendous senses of humor.
How do they tell jokes?
Oh, it's more like sarcasm, but in particular, it's more like sarcasm, and then slapstick humor when somebody falls or makes a mistake or something like that, or a little child says something incorrectly. They all laugh. So they find life in general entertaining. They find it entertaining when you almost get bitten by an alligator because you weren't watching carefully, and then they all laugh at that. Or like when there was a photo spread about me in the New Yorker magazine, and there's a picture where it's just my head coming out of the water, and we had to stay in that position for about an hour, me and the Piraha guy who was in the canoe by me, and he kept joking to me about alligators and anacondas and piranhas coming to get me while I was standing there. So he thought that was very funny. That's the kind of humor they have.
I could not deal with that. I have a deep fear of the water. Were you ever in like any immediate danger in the Amazon that you can recall?
Oh yeah, many times. I was attacked by anacondas and poisonous snakes, and I was swimming in the water with this fellow who taught me the language about my age that I was mentioning, and a woman about 10 yards away by us was gutting a monkey, and as the guts hit the water was just frothing all around it. And I said, "What is that?" And he said, "It's piranhas. They're all over that stuff." I said, "Well, we're very close to them." They said, "Yeah, but there's no blood around us or anything like that. We're good." There is some danger, but I can also say that I've almost been hit by cars and had car accidents almost, and I've had people throw things that almost hit me by mistake. Everybody comes up against threatening experiences. It's just that when they're familiar objects, we're not as afraid. I live in the woods in Massachusetts, and I came back from a jog last year, and I turned around when I was getting to the house, and there was a big, several 100-pound black bear right behind me. And I hadn't heard it or anything, but it was just right there. Well, it didn't scare me all that much, really, because I was already close to the house. It might have scared me more if I was out in the woods when I saw it, but scary things happen to people all the time.
That's true. Well, I mean, living in this environment, that clearly is very dangerous. I mean, I'm curious, do the Piraha have any sort of like mythology? I mean, I know like a lot of indigenous tribes, in North America have concepts of like spirits and monsters and things like that. Does any of that exist among the Piraha, or is that ruled out by their sort of empiricism?
None of it really exists. They have, as I said, these entities that they claim to see, and sometimes they claim to be those entities. So they will come into the village talking in a different voice, dressed, maybe no clothes on and different stuff in their hair, and they will not admit to being Piraha, and they will say that there's these other entities. How much of that is fiction and how much of that is fact? If you talk to them about it, they talk about it like it's fact, but then some of them will sort of smirk when they're talking to you about it. So it fulfills a function, and it is not easily classifiable as fiction or fact. But once again, they're not talking about spirits they can't see. They're talking about spirits they can see. Yeah. So imagine if somebody came into church and said he was Jesus, and everybody thought, this guy's Jesus, and he talks to them and everything, and then he goes out and he comes back in and he's not claiming to be Jesus anymore. Well, we have similar things like that. They're not exactly the same, but we talk about possession by spirits and that sort of thing. So there's a number of U.S. people believe that. They have great faith in that.
A lot of folks believe that. I know people that have done exorcisms or, believe they've done exorcisms. Yeah. Well, I'm curious. I know terms like advanced, primitive, or like good or bad are probably are not the best to use in this context. But I am curious. You mentioned that a lot of the Piraha tribe, especially like the youth, they don't seem to exhibit certain features of like American youth, things like depression or like angst, and the reason for that being that they don't really have any big questions to answer. I mean, do you think that like Western religion or even just like society produces some like negative effects towards the psyche of like American children, teenagers, or what's the difference there?
Well, first of all, no Piraha teenager is worried about a career path or making a living. They all know how to do that. They can all make a living. The career path is to be a hunter-gatherer. That they've got that down. They can do that from the time they're 9 years old, boys and girls. They're not worried about sexual angst. Sex is very free. There's no major barriers to it, no matter what your age is. So a lot of the hangups we have, they're not worried about heaven. They're not worried about hell. They don't have these great regrets of the past. They don't have anxiety over the future. Life is good. The climate is good. If you don't wear clothes, the Amazon is a great climate. It's warm. It's always about 90 degrees in the day and about 70 or 65 in the evening. Which is a 30-degree drop overnight. I mean, so it gets really cool in the dry season, at least. In the rainy season, it's raining all the time. But, life is good. There are not that many environmental challenges as long as you've acquired the skill to fish and hunt and know that every Piraha knows the name of every plant and animal, all the flora and fauna around them. They know all their functions. They have vast knowledge of nature and how it works from the time that they're, really, really young, far exceeding ours. So there's not really any major ritual passage, rite of passage that they have to go through. The boys aren't worried about how they look to find girlfriends or buying jerseys of their favorite sports, having the money to buy a car. These things just don't weigh down on them. And so, and that plus their belief system and their isolation, in my experience, have produced an extremely contented, happy, and very tough and resilient people.
How do you said that? How do relationships work in the Piraha tribes?
You mean romantic relationships?
Yeah, romantic relationships.
Yeah. Well, first of all, sexual experimentation is open to all, so there's no particular relationship that needs to be formed. Everybody, there's not a lot to do for entertainment, so pretty much everyone has slept with everyone one time or another. That's a different thing. Imagine if you walked out your door and you realized that every person that you see, you've had sex with or seen have sex. So it's just a natural thing. It's just not a big deal for them. So romance and this decisions to partner up come about from spending time together, and there's real affection and love, but also, women are looking for things that aren't that different from what people in our society are looking for. Men are looking for women who look like they're going to be fertile and have children and be resilient and have energy to help and work in the fields. And women are looking for men who aren't lazy and who are good hunters and not mean. Although nobody's really mean, you get a lot of individual variation. They want, and these are fairly universal human values, but they're not looking for a man to give them a bigger hut. They don't want anything that's any different than anybody else has. They don't accumulate goods, so they're not looking for a guy with 3 canoes. One canoe is all anybody needs. So why would you need 3 canoes? Although, if your children want canoes, they can get their own when they get old enough. It's not my responsibility to get my son a canoe. If they ought to know how to do that. So these are things that seem to decrease some of the angst. On the other hand, once puberty starts, once those hormones start kicking in, you get a lot of squirrely behavior. Guys showing off for girls and girls showing off for guys, and everybody wanting to have sex with everybody once they hit puberty because, kids, young teenagers playing tag and running around screaming at 3 a.m. Nobody can sleep. But nobody says anything to them either, that nobody tells them, hey, shut up and go to bed, do what you want, I'll find a way to sleep.
Yeah, well, I see why it would be sort of a priority for Christian missionaries if that is seen as like sort of godless behavior.
Yeah, no, it's a priority. I remember coming back on our first trip, and there's so much nudity, and after you've lived among it for a while, you don't even notice it, right? To a Piraha, the female breast is about as sexy as an elbow. So it doesn't really, people are walking around, and sex isn't an issue until you're focused on sex. But other than that, you don't even notice it. So we were showing slides of the Piraha at a church, and I didn't give any warnings that you're going to see a lot of little penises and breasts and stuff like that. And I didn't even notice it. To tell you totally honest, I didn't even notice it. And I had one woman was just furious with me. She said, "And you haven't told them that they need to wear clothes?" I said, "Well, I don't really think the Bible says they need to wear clothes. The Bible says that we should not lust on one another, and they're not doing that. So clothes aren't necessary." And she stopped giving us money. So you get a lot of controversy. So to the idea that they think they're happy and they don't have God and they don't know that they're going to hell. These are the motivations for Christian missionaries to go there. And it was certainly my motivation to go there. I wasn't raised a Christian. I was raised in an atheistic environment, agnostic. And so when I became a Christian, I was very zealous and, had all the energy of the recently converted. And thought that most Christians were just saying they believed, but they really weren't doing anything about it. They were as materialistic as any non-Christian, and they weren't interested in going off to the uttermost parts of the world as the Bible commanded Christians to go to. They weren't taking vows of poverty that the Bible, to me, commanded Christians to do. You should be poor. You should just be serving God and not worry about making it big in the world's eyes. So this was another source of confusion for me. I mean, I would be out there living for years in the jungle doing what I thought the Bible held up as the ideal, and then come back to the States, and most Christians were very indifferent to it, or they thought that holding evangelistic meetings in the U.S. with people who had heard the gospel thousands of times in their life was somehow more important than going to where the gospel had never been heard. So there were a lot of, but it was an interesting life. I loved all my time there, even the conflict that I went through. There was some conflict, there have been some tensions, but that's the way life is. And overall, I wouldn't have traded a minute of it for anything else. I've done field research briefly with North American Indians. I've done field research a little bit longer with Mesoamerican among the Seltal, and I have done most of my field work with about 20 different groups in the Amazon, with most of the time among the Piraha. And it's somehow along the way I was able to get a PhD and very good jobs at outstanding universities. So it's been an extremely rewarding life, but the jungle was the key to all of that. And I didn't have any idea when I started off that it would be.
Yeah. Well, we really appreciate you talking about your experiences. Before we kind of wrap things up, do you have any sort of plugs, places where people can find out more about you, your work, what you're up to nowadays?
Yeah, I have a website, daneverettbooks.org. And on that website, I have links to my 12 or 14, I forget, books and lots of articles and contact information if people want to contact me. If you search for me on the internet, you find tons of videos and articles and good things and bad things. Once you start to put your opinions out there and get well known, there'll be a lot of people who think you're the best thing since sliced bread, and other people who think you're a total jerk. So, you find a widespread of things. I've been discussed in extremely positive terms on Reddit, and then other times on Reddit, for example, in very negative terms. So I really don't read that stuff. I try not to pay attention to it. I just, my website and looking at my own videos on the internet are probably the best ways to find out more about me, except the books are all the greatest endeavors of my intellectual energy. So I've written several books, some like Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, that are for the general audience, and How Language Began, my most recent one. Others are more technical, but they're all there on the website.
Okay, for sure. And as I understand it, don't you also have your own podcast?
Oh, yes, I do. It's The Story of Languages. And we've got, I'm doing this in conjunction with Christian Saunders, who is has a very popular podcast of his own on language, and he lives in Spain. Kangaroo English is about teaching English. Anyway, The Story of Languages is a series of 1 hour plus discussions between me and Christian about language and about life in the Amazon and about philosophy and all sorts of other issues, cognitive science. So I quite enjoy doing that with Christian, and I think it's very useful. I've found many people have written to say they're using it in their classes in places like Hungary and France and other places like this. So I enjoy doing that podcast. Thanks for mentioning that.
I do have a quick question before you go. So obviously, you have a podcast about language, and you are a linguist yourself. I'm curious what you think about conlangs, constructed languages.
Ah, yes.
Oh yeah. Well, some of that is really interestingly done. I mean, there are linguists behind it, and they put in. Usually, if there's a very good linguist behind it, it's an interesting exercise. I don't think that anybody's ever going to learn. These are not going to take over from English. these have special functions. Even Esperanto, which I've offended many people by saying that it's not going anywhere. The reason for that is people learn languages for economic reasons. If you learn to speak Klingon, well, you're identifying with actors who learned it for economic reasons, and we don't have to worry about Klingon becoming the official language of California, because people by and large are economically motivated. If we need to learn a language, we will, and if we don't, we won't, because learning a language is about the hardest thing that humans ever do. It's much harder than calculus or any physics. It's the hardest thing we ever do, is to learn another language well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We ask because we've had David Peterson on before, who he made languages for like Game of Thrones. It's funny that Arrival keeps popping up in this podcast because he hated that film.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he absolutely hated it.
Well, he hated it just because of the end. He didn't like that Jeremy Renner.
Oh yeah, the end of it I thought was stupid. Yeah, the end was. I hated the end. Yeah, that was an exaggeration, but that was the fictional grab for people. But if he's a linguist, he understands the arguments that went into it. And I liked my favorite part of the movie was her just learning the language.
Yeah.
I didn't give a rip about the rest of the movie, to tell you the truth. Amy Adams is really pretty, and she's a good actor. So yeah, I mean, linguists who do these kinds of things, these are really interesting things. I've been asked to be a consultant once or twice on TV shows, never asked to invent a language because I wouldn't do it. It takes too much work. Yeah. I can't imagine investing any of my time in doing that, but I respect the people who do.
Well, Dan, thank you very much for being on with us today, and we really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
That was cool.
Dan is a very interesting man.
He is. I mean, living among an Amazonian tribe for years,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously not all at once, but like going back over and over again. I don't have the outdoor skills for that.
I don't either. Well, to be fair, he brought like a freezer with him. We didn't talk about this in the interview, but he did bring a freezer with him for an extended period of time that he said was stocked with ice cream. So like maybe that would help. That would just be weird, like being in the jungle and also having like your Ben and Jerry's.
Yeah. It'd be weird going from like, living in like the city and like living in like the air conditioning and heating and like a refrigerator and everything, and then going to the Amazon for, however long at once.
I like how he just
hunt every day or whatever, or fish every day.
He just kind of casually dropped, yeah, I've been attacked by like anacondas and stuff. Oh, so here's the thing. I didn't bring this up because I didn't want to sound too stupid, but before I actually like read his book, and to those reading, you should check out his book, Don't Sleep There, Snakes. But when I first was reading like the synopsis, I thought it said piranhas instead of piraha. So then when he started explaining like, this woman was gutting a monkey and there was piranhas in the water, like that's what I was initially envisioning. I'm like, that makes sense that this man goes to the Amazon, sees the brutality of piranhas, and then stops believing in God. I'm like, that checks out.
Yeah. I wonder if it comes from piranha.
Maybe. Well, they probably have a different word for piranhas.
No, they don't call. Yeah, they don't. The piraha do not call themselves piraha, but instead the.
Yeah, no. I've heard him pronounce that word on like a TED Talk.
Yeah, I don't know piraha, so I can't speak it. But
right. But yeah, Dan Everett, everyone, check out his stuff and his podcasts. Interesting guy.
Yeah, it was very cool to learn about.
For sure. Well, we'll see you next time on the Black Sheep broadcast.
Goodbye. Enjoy our content, go ahead and follow us at Broadcast Sheep on Twitter or Black Sheep Broadcast on Instagram.
And you can also follow us at Black Sheep Broadcast on Facebook.
And we have our Black Sheep Broadcast YouTube channel that you should go check out and subscribe to, please.
We're also on SoundCloud. And if you have any stories or experiences that are paranormal, strange, or just plain out there and you want to be on the show, shoot us an email at blacksheepbroadcast@gmail.com. And we'll see you next time on the Black Sheep Broadcast.